is there an argument for legalising a bit of it, but not all of it?
Well, let's speak to Daniel Pryor, who's head of programmes at the Adam Smith Institute. Thank you for joining us, Daniel. Can you clarify some of the mystique around it for people who aren't really familiar with the whole list of drugs that exist?
Sure. So right now in the UK, we've got a very large cannabis market. You can use cannabis or pot or marijuana pretty much interchangeably as far as I'm aware, although in the UK especially, we've got a kind of dominance of very high potency strains that are sometimes called skunk, and they've got high levels of the thing that makes you high in marijuana, which is THC, and quite low levels of CBD, which is a thing that kind of has a protective effect against some of the harms it can cause.
Okay, so CBD good, THC potentially bad.
Yeah, and I'd stress potentially there because the jury is still very much out on whether there's a kind of a causal link between using cannabis and things like schizophrenia. One of the things that perhaps gives me pause for thought is that you'd expect, as cannabis has become stronger in many Western countries, you'd expect schizophrenia rates to have gone up quite significantly, and that just hasn't happened. So there's two kind of competing ideas. One is that cannabis can cause things like psychosis and schizophrenia, and the other one is that it's just that the sort of people who are more likely to use cannabis are also the sort of people more likely to have these sort of mental health issues, and there isn't necessarily a link.
Well, one of the arguments against legalising cannabis in the past has been it's a gateway drug. So if you legalise it, more people who probably wouldn't have been inclined to break the law to use it in the past would be happy to use it. Now it's legal. They'll give it a go. They'd become addicted, and then all of a sudden, they'd start wanting something stronger. They'd get onto heroin. They'd get onto cocaine. Is that a worry for potentially legalising cannabis here?
So I think it's actually a worry for the current system that we have now. Cannabis is a gateway drug, but not in the way that it's commonly talked about. It's a gateway in that someone who might potentially be underage, be a young person, would go to a drug dealer who doesn't ask for ID, and they'd be going to try and get cannabis. And that drug dealer may have other harder drugs that they then offer to that person. So the kind of criminalization that we have at the moment can actually introduce people into the world of criminality more generally. And what we've seen with Canada, actually, is that as well as kind of the aim being to cut into the profits of criminal gangs who we've basically handed this market over to, it's also been passed, the kind of overarching message that Justin Trudeau and the government over there have been pushing is that legalizing cannabis is the best way to protect young people because, as I kind of mentioned, dealers don't ask for ID, whereas legal regulated places that sell cannabis would.
Well, I mean, that's something that we'll obviously find out in time because although Canada's legalised it, it has only just legalised it. So, maybe in a few years' time we'll see whether or not the hopeful effects of it in terms of decriminalising it and stopping the black trade in cannabis is completely wiped out. I mean, only time will tell.
If I could just come in there quickly.
Yeah.
So in some of the US states, there's 9 US states that have legalized it for recreational purposes. And Colorado is the kind of one of the first and the main test case for this. And although they found that overall use of cannabis increased slightly, they also found that use amongst young people and teenagers decreased by a fairly significant amount. And there's evidence coming out of there that it's disrupted the black market, especially in the kind of areas where legal cannabis outlets are set up. There's some very good kind of academic evidence that's looked at this and found that there's been large reductions in crime around the areas of the cannabis dispensaries specifically. So there is a fairly large body of evidence that I would argue supports the case for legalization. But Canada is going to be an interesting one because all those different provinces are taking different approaches in Canada. So we're going to see what works best and what doesn't.
So if Colorado's a test case, why has it not been adopted or legalised in more states of America?
Well, it's something that takes a long time, but 9 states have already done it, and the evidence coming out there is being looked at by policymakers in lots of different states. Now, obviously, there's a lot of pushback on this, lots of different counter-arguments that can be made about legalising drugs, but I think that gradually the tide is turning, and with Canada legalising today, I think that it's probably only a matter of time, the next 5 to 10 years, before at least this conversation gets serious in the UK. There's already a lot of different groups from a lot of different political perspectives that support this, and I think the case is growing day by day.
Do you think it will become legal in the UK then eventually?
I do. I'm fairly confident that in 5 to 10 years, we'll have legalized recreational cannabis. Obviously, we had medical cannabis legalized by the Home Secretary very recently. And I think that the debate around the world, not just in the UK, is moving towards this recreational legalization and regulation, more importantly.
Okay, stay with me, Daniel. David Rains is on the line, spokesperson for the National Drug Prevention Alliance. David, you've been listening to what Daniel's had to say there. Has he convinced you that that maybe there's a good case for us legalising it here in the UK?
I disagree with virtually everything he had to say.
Okay.
I don't think it's likely to be legalised in the UK. I mean, since I retired from law enforcement, I've been involved in this debate since 2000. And then people were saying it would be legalised within 10 years. People were saying in the mid-1990s, when the Independent on Sunday really started the campaign, when editor was Rosie Boycott. And a few years ago, the Independent on Sunday changed its position on its front page. He said they'd been wrong. The two main parties are almost at one on it, with a few outliers, a few independent-minded MPs. But when cannabis was reclassified upwards in 2008-9, the two main parties both supported it. I think it's very unlikely. Now, the issue about mental health, I mean, obviously Daniel downplays it, I would say. I think it's fairly conclusive. The big issue now is the teratogenic effects of cannabis and the epigenetic effects and the technical words.
Sorry, yeah, what does that actually mean, David? It's not a word I'm familiar with.
I was going to do that. I realised.
Sorry, okay.
Technical words. Teratogenesis, that's really the effect that thalidomide had on the unborn child. And there's a paper on the British Medical Journal website beginning of August that talks about cannabis teratogenicity needing to be considered. And there's several conditions that come with cannabis. In fact, there's been some fact-finding done in Canada. And the Nunavik regions of Canada have had a big increase in a condition called gastroschisis, which is where babies are born with their large intestine outside their gut. There's been an outbreak of that in Hawaii. There's been an outbreak in South Wales, and there is a warning about this on the NHS Wales website. But
David, it's worth pointing out, we're not talking about cutting down the use or increasing the use of cannabis. We're talking about the legalisation of it.
Well, legalisation inevitably would increase the use. At the moment, we've got a situation where we've got about 6 to 7% use cannabis. We've got about 14 to 16% use tobacco, and that is way down from the 48% that used to use tobacco in 1948. So there's clearly a great deal of room for the use of cannabis to extend, to be deeper. People start using in their youth and often stop, but there's clearly a great deal of room for that to increase. So we are talking about a big increase in use because we've been normalising something that is currently illegal.
David, I'd imagine that those who don't agree with you would say, but we've already got legal drugs in this country, namely alcohol and tobacco, which have huge negative impacts on our health. We know about them. There's been a huge campaign specifically for smoking and tobacco. If your argument is to not have cannabis legal because of how dangerous it is for our health, does that not surely mean we need to ban alcohol and tobacco too?
Well, actually, you could reverse the argument, can't you? You can say we've got a huge harm from the tobacco industry and the alcohol industry worldwide. Why would you add to it? Why would you normalise? I mean, the question it comes down to, and I think this is the one that the Adam Smith Institute really failed to address, is what is the net public good from it? I can enumerate the harms. What is the net public good?
Okay, well, hang on. That's a fair question, but so let's put it to Daniel. Net public good, Daniel.
Sure. So I think that it protects young people. It removes a path to criminality, gives people information on the potential health effects. It cuts into gang profits. It raises tax revenues for treating problem users. It introduces alternatives to the sort of high potency strains that we see on the market. I think all of those things are really important for the public good. And just to respond to a few of the points that were made there, I think that the idea of law enforcement and police being against this is perhaps too simplistic. If you look at law enforcement against prohibition, an organisation that enjoys an awful lot of police and ex-police membership in the UK, they're certainly campaigning for cannabis legalisation. And specifically with Canada, what you've seen is this coalition of public health experts and also law and order conservatives that have pushed through this measure. It's certainly not something that's opposed in a kind of blanket way by people in law enforcement or by public health professionals. In fact, I think that the opposite is true, certainly in Canada and increasingly so in the UK. And when
Daniel,
it comes to...
Sorry to disturb you, Daniel. I hear you mention there about the stronger versions of cannabis, and we know there's synthetic cannabinoids as well. And you're suggesting that if we legalise it, it would provide an alternative option to stronger options which are available on the underground market. Surely if we legalised it, anything stronger that came through would just go underground anyway, and then we'd have a black market drug problem and a criminal drug problem anyway.
Well, that depends on how exactly you legalise and regulate. So, for example, if you tax higher potency strains a slightly higher amount, you may be able to discourage their use without necessarily pushing it into the black market too much. And I do accept when, say, California recently legalised, the price compared to the black market there was significantly higher in the legal market. So it meant that the black market was still there to a certain extent, and they've learned those lessons and are starting to reduce prices and reduce taxation rates there. So I think that right now, young people already have easy access to unregulated cannabis, as does everyone else. But that's incentivized by prohibition. There aren't any alternatives on the market. There isn't information for people who buy them. And I'm just looking now at the Canadian leaflet that's given out to everyone who purchases recreational cannabis in Canada. And it basically informs people about THC and CBD and all the different health effects and risks.
Yeah, I think about 15 million people were given information leaflets. David, have you heard anything there that's convinced you otherwise?
I've heard nothing that convinces me otherwise. I think it's nonsense. There isn't a public good. The high strength cannabis. Well, I mean,
you can't just. I mean, I think Daniel actually highlighted some sensible issues there, just to say that.
I can address them if you don't interrupt.
Okay, well, go on then.
The high strength cannabis that's on the British streets is a product of consumer demand, and if there's consumer demand for it, the criminal market will continue to supply it, even if we have low strength cannabis available from legal outlets. And more than that, illegal outlets will always be able to undercut legal outlets in price because they don't pay any taxes.
They don't do that with cigarettes. They don't do that with cigarettes or alcohol, do they?
Yes, they do.
Do they?
Well,
okay. Yeah.
25% of the UK tobacco market, when I was active in customs, was either counterfeit, smuggled, or both. And in fact, you're in Kent.
No, I hear what you say. Yeah, no, that's fair point. Yeah, sorry.
I think you might need to pull yourself together there.
Okay, all right, well, we'll leave it there then, David, because it is 21 minutes past 3 now, and time for the latest news headlines. Here's Lauren.
A jury has heard rules on spending...